In closing our chapter 2 population chapter, we need to consider a few population debates and additionally some population policies that we've already talked about. For one, the question has always arisen, will the world's population ever outrun or outpace the production of resources? And that's actually going to be first addressed by a British economist named Thomas Robert Malthus. Thomas Malthus actually, if you look at the age of his, or the really the years of his life, he is going to be writing a book called The Essay on the Principle of Population in 1798. Now, keep in mind, okay, these time periods, 1766 to 1834, okay, when he writes the pamphlet, 1798 is going to be right in the midst of the Industrial Revolution, which of course began in Great Britain. He argues that there are two constants in human life, food and sex. Food, of course, in order to survive, and sex in order to reproduce and therefore carry on the human species. Without these two things, the human species would cease to exist. Well, you have to consider what he was actually seeing at the time in the streets of Great Britain. To give you an idea, if you're familiar with A Christmas Carol or Charles Dickens, this is going to be the time period where you have really a lot of people living in the cities because they have fled from their small farms into the cities. This is because of a lot of the agricultural advances. So, for example, seed drills, plows, two horse yokes, okay, those types of things. Not super revolutionary to us, but the types of things that are going to increase the yield for farmers. Therefore, the poor farmers who can't afford the equipment are going to end up being bought out by the wealthy farmers, this called the enclosure movement, and therefore the poorer farmers are going to move to the cities. Well, when they first move to the cities, factories are not necessarily up and running because that comes a little bit later in the Industrial Revolution. So Thomas Malthus actually sees a large number of people just sitting around in the streets of London, really kind of causing mischief, a lot of poverty, really just a very depressing scene. And he would suggest, okay, that this has created a surplus of unnecessary workers. Not only that, but the unnecessary workers have brought with them, okay, their unnecessary children, which of course used to be economically advantageous, and now, okay, are just more mouths to feed in the streets of London. So, the power of population, he suggests, is actually greater than the Earth's ability to create food. And his prediction was that eventually, unless the crude birth rate decreased because of moral restraint, so people choosing to not have sex, or unless there was some sort of catastrophic event where we have disease or famine or war that will decrease the population, he believed that eventually we would outrun or outpace the availability of food. Now, when we talk about Malthus, we know that today that is not the case. Okay, the world actually, interestingly enough, creates enough food to feed 11 billion people a year. And we only have 7 billion. So then the question arises, why are there areas where there is starvation and famine? So if you take a look, okay, at Neo-Malthusians are new Malthusians. These are people that believe that Malthus was onto something. He may not have been 100% correct, but he was certainly in the right ballpark. And perhaps looking at the way that things have progressed across the demographic transition model, we may actually be in worse shape than Malthus could have ever have predicted. Okay. All joking aside, okay, these are going to be ones that would suggest that the more humans there are, the more we're killing our planet. Additionally, family trees are best to have no branches on your family trees, potentially instead of having children, maybe adopting children. But the idea here is, again, it's a contemporary approach. These are modern day people calling for strict demographic controls or population policies. There are two reasons why they say that Malthusian theory is actually worse today than Malthus could have ever guessed. Two reasons. One, keep in mind that Malthus is going to die in the 1800s. Because he dies in the 1800s, he fails to predict that LDCs, less developed countries, are going to ever move into stage 2 of the demographic transition model. Consider how he saw the death rate decreasing, therefore the population increasing in stage 2, and therefore poverty in the streets of Great Britain. Now imagine, if you can, the sub-Saharan African countries whose death rate is going to plummet because of the medical revolution in the 1950s, and because of that, a huge population boom in the streets of, we'll say, for example, Chad or Niger or Sierra Leone, and yet, unlike the MDCs, the crude birth rate has never actually decreased. So population is actually growing much, much faster than the economic growth and the resources available in those LDCs. Additionally, it's not food that we should be worried about. The Neo-Malthusians suggest that instead of food, we should really be concerned about clean air, water, petroleum, and sustainable farmland. Those are going to be the things that people should actually consider as our precious resources that we may outpace, whereas food is something that we have been able to adapt to. Now, if we're talking about Neo-Malthusians, then let's talk about people that would suggest that those people are really kind of doomsday people. These are going to be your Malthus critics. The Malthus critics are going to suggest that yes, Malthus was wrong, and not only was he wrong, but we should never really have to worry about anything like this. The root of their argument is going to be possibilism. They would suggest that while perhaps an area of the earth is not suitable for living, so it is not ecumene, we actually have the potential to adapt to our surroundings. For example, this vertical farm on the right side of the page. Vertical farming is a revolutionary idea. It's rather expensive, but once it's created, it's actually pretty ingenious. This can be put in any area of the world, regardless of climate, because each level can be climate controlled, humidity controlled. Additionally, you are not dealing with any sort of soil, as this is hydroponic farming, which uses water and just the nutrients that are necessary for whatever the plant is being grown, whatever it needs. Additionally, each of the levels rotates so that it can be either in full view of the sun, or if a plant maybe does not need any sunlight or needs very little sunlight, it can actually rotate away from the sun. Other ideas, you can see that it is clean energy using solar panels. Because there is no soil, you're not going to need any insecticides or really any sort of fertilizers, fungicides, etc. So it's a revolutionary idea. And again, okay, it's rather expensive, but these are the types of things that Malthusian critics would say that humans will naturally come up with. The larger the population, the more brain power we have, the more economic growth, the more production that we're going to be able to have, and likely the more people we have to help improve the technology and really show that possibilism. Other things that Malthusian critics would point out was that Malthus was incorrect in that there is not really a relationship between the population and hunger. Instead, a lot of it has to do with the unjust political and social institutions. The idea that only those with the largest amount of money are going to be able to feed their families. This is going to be, of course, Karl Marx communism, and the idea, okay, that if it is spread evenly, okay, people will be able to all provide for their families. Again, Frederick Engels, also a Marxist, is going to suggest that there is plenty of food if we shared it equally across the Earth's surface. However, because of capitalism, that is not possible. A farmer's not going to just give their food up in order to be able to equally provide it across the Earth's surface. Instead, it's a supply and demand, a capitalism, eat or be eaten world, and those who do not have the money inevitably will experience the hunger. Other ideas that Malthusian critics are going to suggest is that perhaps more people is not necessarily a bad thing. The more people you have, perhaps the more men you have in your military. And the more men you have in your military, perhaps the more power you have. With that power, you may be able to take over areas that have food if you do not. Other ideas is simply entrepreneurship. A true entrepreneur in capitalist world is going to look at the demand for something, whatever the consumer's demand is, and try to find a way in order to provide a resource or some sort of product that will meet that demand. So let's talk about the reality. We know Neo-Malthusians say it's worse than he ever thought. We know the critics say don't worry about it, it's never going to be an issue. But what is the actual reality of the Malthusian theory? How correct was he? Well, overall, on a global scale, he's highly too pessimistic. Regions with the highest natural increase rates today, we are able to say that they are in danger of food shortages. However, a lot of those food shortages are because of factors outside of the earth being able to sustain the food. In fact, food production grew faster since 1950 than it has in the past, much of that due to the Green Revolution in the 1970s, where we're going to use higher yield crops, we're going to be using insecticides and fertilizers, we're going to be using fungicides, we're going to be using even things like GMOs, genetically modified organisms. We're going to be using combines. All of these things are going to actually create higher yield, which means we bring in more food, which means the price is going to decrease, and therefore, hopefully, food will be more available to people who were not able to get it before. The unequal distribution, as I mentioned, okay, again, Malthus did not really predict that if we could spread it out evenly, everybody would be okay. And Malthus never predicted that the birth rate would go down. The population, of course, is increasing at a slower rate. While it is still increasing, it is increasing at a slower rate in the past 30 years than it was in the early 1900s. And it appears as though that's going to continue to be the trend. So, how do governments deal with these population issues? The question of resource availability, the question of dependency ratio, and the productive members of society being able to take care of the old and the youth cohorts. Well, many of them are going to use population policies, and population policies are going to be those that they are designed to affect any or all of several objectives. It could mean that they are wanting to influence the size of the population, either encouraging childbirth, discouraging childbirth, perhaps the composition of the society, so maybe certain demographics of the population, certain ethnicities of the population. As much as we hate to say it, population policies would include things like the genocides of Rwanda or perhaps the Holocaust. And this idea where your policy is designed to change the composition of your population. When we look at the issue of natalism, natalism is actually going to be the promotion of human reproduction. Natalist countries are those that are going to be providing financial incentives. This is the whole 3 more in Singapore family holiday, so to speak, $25,000 for anyone who can give birth to a baby on a certain day. And if you take a look, okay, the top right says, so much fun, so much laughter, so much love forever after. Why wait? With a family, life's great. Kids make you see how happy life can be. Okay, this is again trying to persuade people to have children. Hong Kong is experiencing this. We know Japan is experiencing this. Okay, and potentially other Western European countries are going to be experiencing this in the future. Your anti-natalists, though, are going to be concerned with limiting the population growth. These are going to be ones that would suggest that we are outpacing our resources, and therefore we need to actually decrease our birth rate, bring down the birth rate. Probably the best ways to bring down the birth rate, of course, is going to be to increase women's rights and economic power, and additionally, birth control and family planning. However, China's one-child policy is a good example of anti-natalists. Iran, for some time, is going to provide birth control to their people. And other areas of the world are going to try to bring down the natalist approach. A good example of this is going to be your natalists on the right-hand side at the bottom. These would be your anti-natalists, the people that want to spend their money on themselves rather than have, okay, 2 cute, darling little stick figures for children. The population forecast, for example, increasing crowdiness was a bumper sticker of a natalist society. When we talk about the China's one-child policy, keep in mind gender side. Additionally, you guys are going to be viewing a video that's somewhat shocking tomorrow and potentially today if you have time, and that's going to be the American eugenics movement. I want you to consider for a moment whether or not the United States would ever be able to enact some sort of population policy, whether it be to increase population or decrease the population. Or somehow change the composition. So consider that for a moment, because at one point in time, there are several states in the United States that are going to carry out a population policy, and I think that you'll find the results rather surprising and perhaps even disturbing.